It's Ten Commandments Day today. This is Exodus chapter 20. I thought I broadly knew these in terms of thou shalt not kill, love thy neighbour as thyself. Turns out both wrong, so it's a good job we're looking at these and fixing that. This takes place just after the end of the last story, so God's come down to Mount Sinai as fire and smoke and all the rest of it. Tells everybody don't set foot on the mountain or you're going to be put to death. He then immediately launches into these Ten Commandments which he's telling to Moses and to Aaron. First one we've got is no other gods before me, he puts it, which is interesting in the sense that sort of suggests that there are other gods, but I assume that's not what that means. I'm guessing that's more a metaphorical other gods in terms of higher values or something, because it doesn't make a great deal of sense to suggest that he's in competition with others. It goes a bit further on that in the second commandment, saying about you will have no images of anything in heaven, on earth or under the sea, which would seem to rule out any forms of written art, which can't actually be the case, surely. So I assume I've misunderstood that. The third commandment is the don't take the Lord's name in vain. I've always heard that as, but it's not misusing God's name as it has in the Bible here. It's difficult to know where the edges are on that. I mean, obviously something along the lines of Richard the Lionheart doing the Crusades and all the rest of it, killing lots of people. Pretty sure that's going to be an abuse of misusing God's name. But whether stubbing your toe and say, oh God, or something, presumably not. But interesting in terms of where those distinctions are. There's the fourth commandment, keep the Sabbath. As we've seen already in the videos up to this point, God is very keen on the Sabbath and making sure that's still a thing. There's honour your mother and father. This seems reasonable. I guess most mums and dads were doing the best and all the rest of it, but there's no context in terms of terrible parents. I get they are rare, but they are around. Where I thought it was thou shalt not kill, it's actually you will not murder. I appreciate that's a slightly pedantic distinction between the two there, but one would be deemed sort of lawful, one would be deemed just really horrible. Interesting, this one, it sort of falls down in terms of, well, God's telling you to do something that he does. I mean, he's even in the context of this story, he said to people who will set foot on the mountain, they will be put to death. I guess there's an argument whether that's murder or not. And maybe it's punishment, but still it's killing someone who is not trying to kill you, which in modern society terms I think we'd probably deem to be deeply uncool killing anyway. There's do not commit adultery, which is straightforward and interesting, but at the same time there's been a lot of that going on. I guess the rule wasn't there it is now, and we'll see if people behave themselves better going forwards. You won't steal, you won't lie. This is false witness about your neighbour, but taking that to be lying. And interesting, the final one being you will not covet your neighbour's stuff. I assume your neighbour in this context is basically any fellow human. But the interesting thing is that the rest of those are all sort of measurable. If you've murdered someone, there's a dead body. If you've stolen something, there's something in your garage that isn't yours. If you covet something, no one's going to know. So it's interesting in the sense that there's sort of three different elements to those commandments. The first one's being how God wants you to treat him. And it does say in the second commandment actually that he actually states he is a jealous God, which is very odd in biblical terms, but he's clearly very keen on gaining all this praise and worship. It doesn't translate well into human terms, that I don't think, in the sense that if a person was like that, we'd judge them to be narcissistic and we certainly don't want them over for dinner. But I guess in creator terms, maybe that's not so bad. The second batch in the commandments, I guess broadly you could paraphrase that as don't be a punk. Pretty straightforward in the basis that we're supposedly born with the intrinsic knowledge of good and evil. It's just a bit of structure to that. But then that final one about not coveting, given that no one can see that about someone else if they are coveting something, at least if they don't act on it, 'cause it does say that the sin is just to covet. It doesn't mean you have to actually do anything about it. The sin is clearly internal. that seems much more of a principle for life. I mean, a good one, to be fair, but it's yeah, it stands out from the others, and there's sort of three categories almost of commandments there. There's a horrible part in the second commandment, the no images and all the rest of it, talking about God being a jealous God, and anyone who worships other gods instead and hates the real God, he will punish them down to 4 generations of the family. There's a positive flip side in that if you do the right thing, then you get all the good stuff for 1,000 generations, which is a very long time. But yeah, the idea that you could be punished for what your great grandparents did or something, I don't really like that, I have to say, but it doesn't sit well at all. But clearly that's how things are working at the minute. There's part of the story where all the Israelites are saying to Moses, we don't want to see God because we are scared, because the mountain's doing its rumbling and all the rest of it. I have looked this up, by the way. It doesn't look like it's likely this was actually a volcano or something and it's just been turned into a story. But the Israelites are clearly terrified. And Moses says to them that the fear is partly to help them, to keep them from sinning. And it's interesting that there would be the idea of using that fear to drive better behaviour. And it seems somewhat self-defeating of the idea we've looked at earlier, in the sense that God seems to want people to choose to be good. But I guess there has to be some sort of evidence for what you should be adhering to. I guess in that sense there's almost an unfairness, in the sense that, assuming this account were true, these people may not have seen God because they were too scared to go and see him and had Moses relay the information. But they saw a rumbling mountain and a weird cloud in the day and a sea split in two and plagues and all the rest of it. Whereas we haven't seen anything for 2,000 years. So there seems a benefit for them in being in that time. Not I've swapped, to be fair. I mean, the oppression in Egypt and then this desert business isn't sounding like a lot of fun at all. But even so, there's only question we'll have to address as we go along here. Right? How come there's lots of evidence for this lot, and then for the last 2,000 years, nothing? And you've got Chinese whispers almost, to some extent, as the information's passed down lots of generations, and we have to just sort of deal with that sort of drought of knowledge, I guess, as it were. There's an interesting idea that occurred to me, in the sense that we've had some 1,000 years up until this point, and there's been no explicit rules from God. Suddenly these rules will turn up. So why are there rules now? And my understanding is that in Christianity it's a lot more principle-based than rule-based, and I think that's partly where the deviation happened between Christianity and Judaism, obviously than the whole Jesus part. But I think that the outcome seemed to me to be rules versus principles almost. So I get the impression that these commandments are of this time and they are going to evolve later on. I was thinking about that in terms of, we don't teach a 5-year-old to drive a car. Well, 5-year-olds can't reach the pedals, can they? You don't teach a 12-year-old to drive a car because they're just not ready enough to do that. So perhaps there's that same idea in terms of maturity of civilizations and culture over time. And this is where humanity has got to at this point. So yes, here we go, some very rigid, don't do this, do that. And that can evolve over time because that's where they happen to be. I quite like that idea, I think. That's something else to take forward with us and keep in the back of mind. Finally, we have a really odd bit right at the end. It's basically God has delivered the 10 Commandments. He's now saying, go worship me, burn your sacrifices, all the rest of it, build an altar. But of this altar, God says, and do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed. I beg your pardon. I don't know if that's because what they wore in the old days was kind of like tunics, I guess, or something. So if you're standing below someone, they're standing higher up, you can see up their shorts. But yeah, I don't know what to do with that. I just thought I'd share that because it's in there. In the next video, this is an awful lot of rules. I mean, there's hundreds more. So I'll do a very brief summary of those, and then we'll see if that adds some more context for us.